The mix of Emily Dickinson poems in our book is interesting. In some cases, they have chosen ones that are among her best known and most strongly expressed. Because I Could Not Stop for Death, probably the most famous Emily Dickinson poem of all, is in here. Some of the others, like This Is My Letter to the World, Success is Counted Sweetest, A Bird Came Down the Walk, these are usually seen when Emily Dickinson poems are anthologized. There are several other cases where I had never seen this poem except in this book. If My Bark Sink, The Beggar Lad, and If I Can Stop One Heart from Breaking. And I think that these were chosen to slant the selection a little bit toward faith. I don't think that's wrong, but I think that those who edited the book wanted to focus on the positive ideas and not so much on some of the rather more difficult doubting poems that I have referred to earlier. The 5 poems that are about faith or immortality, which ones would you say those are? We're going to look especially at Because I Could Not Stop for Death, arguably her best known, certainly one of her longest poems, as Emily Dickinson's poems were quite short. It has such a wealth of images and ideas that I want to go through it stanza to stanza and discuss it on Heart from Breaking at the end of this video. Here we have a literary technique where death is presented as a carriage driver. Do you remember what that technique is called? It's personification. That is presenting something that is abstract or not human as if it were. Remember that in Whitman, death was the dark mother gliding near with soft feet. Death was not something frightening in this case, but something loving and comforting. Emily Dickinson is in between. She presents death neutrally. Death shows up with his horses and his carriage, takes her away to her eternal home. It is not presented either as frightening or as particularly comforting or loving, which is interesting given that Emily Dickinson did not have a very strong faith for much of her life. But it is a very original image. And notice that she does believe in immortality, because immortality in line 4 is shown as, let's say, the ghost or abstract figure sitting with her and death in the carriage. The eternal nature of death is shown. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, there is no hurry in eternity. And of course the very strong last stanza, after they have reached the house that seemed a swelling of the ground. I'm going to ask you in the discussion posts what you think that is. And then she ends the poem very effectively, I think, by that centuries have passed. This is someone who, from Dickinson's 19th century, might have died in the Middle Ages, and yet feels shorter than the day. All that time, as this eternity passes, and it doesn't even make sense for us in time to talk about eternity as passing along, because it doesn't. All of that, let's call it time, is shorter than that first day when she went on her ride past this world, saying goodbye to the things of the world, and then realized that the horses were pointing toward eternity. A beautiful image at the end. As far as those things of the world, in the middle stanzas, Emily Dickinson presents imagery of day-to-day life, imagery of an active life, which, of course, is the life that she is leaving. Good ideas chosen. children playing at recess in lines 9 and 10, the grain, and then we passed the setting sun, or rather he passed us. Who passed them? Of course, it was that the sun went past. They moved on into sort of a darkness and dawn together with the dew on toward eternity. Death is seen as being civil in line 8, polite, but neither the warm, loving death figure, I especially think of James Weldon Johnson's poem that we'll look at later called Go Down Death, God sending death to bring someone to heaven, to bring someone to Jesus, nor, as I mentioned before, the fearful death figure that Jonathan Edwards types in the Middle Ages tried to scare people with. The three poems on page 316, two of them particularly short, but both expressing a strong metaphor, all, again, as I said, say roughly the same thing. The theme can be expressed best in God's residence. Who has not found the heaven below will fail of it above. How could we rewrite that line? I would say that we could paraphrase it as, we will not get to heaven unless on this earth we make of it as much of a heaven as we can. We have as strong and close a relationship with God as we can. Heaven is not a distant place in some other dimension of angels and standard images like wings and harps that probably aren't really true. Heaven is also what we do here on earth and how close we are to God. The kingdom of heaven has come, Jesus proclaimed. It has been here on earth since he arrived. She follows that up with the idea of God lives next to me, connected again, of course, to the idea of closeness to God. And then she comes up with a metaphor. His furniture is love. Although this isn't a well-known poem, this is an interesting example of how unusual Emily Dickinson's metaphors can be, like those of the metaphysical poets. You might remember Edward Taylor. His furniture is love. How can love be like furniture? Love is something soft and gentle, something that we can't see or touch. Furniture is something solid, hard, and that we certainly can touch. I will ask you on the message board why you think she selected such lines. If my bark sink is more simply stated and a little easier to follow. Bark means boat in this case. The word is used in some other older poems. If my boat sinks, it sinks to another sea. The idea of life is a journey. The boat is what we are traveling in, a familiar enough one. The idea of the ground floor, of course, which kind of mixes with the sailing and journey metaphor, is that beneath, as she puts it this way just to make her point, beneath this world is eternity, immortality. There is something more. We don't just die. So the faith is obviously strongly expressed there. The Beggar Lad is a very interesting poem. It reminds me of Hans Christian Andersen's story of the little match girl. There's a similar one about a heavenly Christmas tree that Dostoevsky wrote. All of these stories picture a poor child, a child forgotten by this world, a child that it seems nobody is going to be helpful toward or do anything for. The child, the beggar, hears the trudging feet past him. Nobody listens to him. But what happens in the last stanza? Who is him? Well, of course, Jesus is the one who said, "Let the little children come to me, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven."
no child who ever called on Jesus for help, no adult, but certainly no child, as Emily Dickinson states in those last two lines, would ever be ignored, would ever not be listened to. Rather an interesting image here in that it is not the person that supplicates, that pleads to, cries out to, asks for things from God in the end, but it is the coat, almost as if the ragged clothes that represent our earthly bodies that in the end, of course, we will not have, is the thing asking Jesus for help and, of course, getting it in the end. Most likely meaning, as we see from the first line, the child actually died, as in both the Hans Christian Andersen and Dostoevsky stories, but after his suffering on earth went to heaven.
Finally, we'll look at the last two poems on this theme in our book, I Never Saw a Moor. It should be noted, my students sometimes get this wrong. This is not a Moor like Othello. This is not a black man from Africa. It is a Moor as in the highlands of northern England, the wild, heather-filled territory of the Bronte sisters' passionate novels. Americans will never have seen it unless they go to England. My wife went to college on the moors, and I've been there with her. But Emily Dickinson, with her limited experience, had never seen a moor, and amazingly, although she was from Massachusetts, she had never seen the sea. Heather is it's a purple-colored plant. It's the plant that grows on the moor. The billow is the billows of the waves. What she's saying is an answer to the most standard argument against faith. Why don't we see God? Why isn't there something visible or audible for us? And even in the Bible, where it tells of visible or audible things, God spoke to Elijah or Moses. People saw the Holy Spirit as a dove coming down to Jesus. We don't really know what kind of experience that was and whether it was the senses as we use them. People will say, God doesn't speak to me. I don't see him. If I could see him, I would know it was true. Well, Emily Dickinson says, we believe that there is a sea. We believe that there are landscapes on this earth that we have never seen. Why can't you believe in heaven? Why can't you believe in God? Just because you can't see him, as the second stanza suggests. If I Can Stop One Heart from Breaking, as I said, very little known poem. I think the book just put it in there to show a gentler Emily Dickinson, one that, at least in this poem, states that she believes in Christian principles. The fainting robin reminds me of the bird, and a bird came down the walk, as if she could help some little bird that had fallen out of his nest. But I think that the one in the first stanza is the key thing here. One good act, one soul saved, is worth everything. Dostoevsky, the Russian writer, is said to have tried to work out whether great miracles and large things that God did, or whether just the sum total of kind acts, small kind acts done day to day, were the most important thing. Concluded finally, as we can see in his fiction, that just being a moral, loving person and helping others day to day is the most important thing. That's how the kingdom of heaven is built. That's the message that Dickinson is giving us. It's a simple one. We're told it all the time, but that's because it's a message that should be given. Be good, be kind to other people, take the opportunity to do good deeds when you can, and you are building on earth, as Dickinson suggests in other poems. Earth and heaven are not so far apart. Building on earth that kingdom of heaven which is within you.